Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about postcolonial identities. Now, this was a question that was posed to me through the comments in Urdu, so I had recorded a video in Urdu trying to answer this question, and then someone asked me if I would be recording it in English as well. Most of the times, what I do is that I always make sure that whatever I record is available in English. And that's not just me privileging English over Urdu or anything else. It's just because most of my students, all of them actually, English is their medium of learning. English is the medium of instruction that I use, and then that's the language in which I publish. So hence, that's the language in which I have expertise. So Urdu is not my native language. It's the national language of Pakistan, which I learned. So here we go, because I thought there was a need to articulate this in English as well. So first of all, you probably noticed that I don't call it post-colonial identity, because there is no singular post-colonial identity. Every nation on this planet which went through the 19th and 20th century colonialism developed specific post-colonial identities. And those identities were developed either in response to the imperatives, both hegemonic and dominant, of the colonizers, or as a reaction or as resistance to that. The reason we study it in post-colonial studies is not with this idea that somehow colonialism is what determines all identities, but to trace what happens to people. How do they shape their identities during colonialism and after they have either evicted the colonizers or defeated them, or if they have left. That's the main idea. Now, in terms of a larger debate, there is, of course, a wonderful book by Chinwe Zhu, right, called Decolonizing the African Mind. In that, he discusses on an abstract level two kinds of identities that emerge in colonized nations. And this is like a huge abstraction, but it somewhat works. Right? So he draws from Shakespeare's The Tempest, in which, of course, there is Prospero, the Duke of Milan, who's a wizard, and then there are two native figures, Ariel and Caliban. Now, Ariel is a willing servant to Prospero. Prospero has a deal with him, a contract with him, that in return for his services, he will free Ariel when he leaves the island. Caliban is the defiant one, because he needs to be kept in check through brute force. And most of the times when Prospero wants to punish him, he asks Ariel to do that. Now from this, Chinwe Zhu theorizes that when the colonizers leave, there are two kinds of identities that they leave behind: the Ariels and the Calibans. And so the Ariels in any given post-colony are the people who had benefited from colonialism, who were part of the elite, never really cared about their own people, but they also inherit the post-colony. These are the rich, the powerful, the politicians. And then there are Calibans, the people. Most of the times, the elite, their worldview is still in sync with their former colonial masters. They live the same kind of expensive lifestyle. They travel to Europe, travel to America. And they sometimes look at their own people very disdainfully, right? And don't do anything for them, or have not tried to change their lives. So this is the big dichotomy that Chinwe Zhu works with, and his project is to empower Caliban. You can look at post-colonial identities in these two broad spectrums. But beyond that, any given post-colonial nation, remember, they already had their cultural differences, which get heightened during colonialism because colonizers use one group against the other, right? So in the post colonies, then there are religious identities. There could be Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, right? And those are what we call religious or communal identities. They sometimes get mobilized against each other, but they can also be made to work. And those are some of the identities that you can study as a student of post-colonial studies. How do they work? Where does the conflict come? Right? What is the conflict in the post nation? All of those things you can study very easily. Then there are, of course, gender identities, women, men, transgender people, right? What are their rights, right? How do they exist? Has the post-colonial nation state issued, resolved any of their issues, like changed their lives? There are regional identities. Where are you from in any given nation? North, South, Nigeria, Kenya, right? India, Pakistan, because those regional identities can also be ethnic, can be language based, right? So what you're trying to trace is what happens during colonialism, how are these regional and linguistic identities are mobilized, and is there a legacy that travels to post-colony, or did the post-colonial nation state did something to heighten those tensions, right? And pit one community against the other. You're seeing that a lot in Africa, in India, right? The politics right now of the right wing is to pit Muslims and Hindus against each other, right? In Pakistan, you see similarly people from Balochistan, Punjab, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa having their differences. And what further complicates that is the political identities, right? People are part of different kinds of politics. They join different kinds of political parties. And based on that, their worldview is defined differently, and they look at each other as if they are belligerent groups. Politicians use that to their own advantage. So, I mean, if you take the example of Pakistan right now, there is one political party in power, but they're not just talking about the bad policies that the previous governments made. There are now vocabularies being developed where if you follow another political party, you are probably not a good person, you're probably morally suspect. These are the things that happens in political identities, and then they get hardened, right? In India, you can see that that's what BJP is doing, right? Valorizing a certain retrieved history of Hinduism, right? And then scapegoating the Muslim populations and other minorities. And so those are political identities connected also to religious identities, regional identities. And then in any given post-colonial nation state, you will also see what could be social identities. What kind of social status do you have? The question of class, right? Are you workers? Are you peasants? So identities based in what you do, right? And those play a huge role as well. In Muslim countries, usually there will be sectarian identities, right? Are you Sunni? And if you're a Sunni, are you Wahhabi or Ahle Hadith or whatever in Pakistan, Bangladesh? Are you Shia? These are Shia and Sunni are the two major divisions, and then those differences play a role in any given post-colonial nation state. And how do we deal with these complexities? I mean, my advice would be, first of all, don't flatten it. Don't talk about just one single post-colonial identity because that's very reductive and it doesn't exist. Two, don't offer people from the post-colonies as these vacant recipients of the colonial dictates or as simply as victims. It would be really, really not smart to just argue that colonizers were able to create these identities without the natives being there. Yes, there are instances of that, right? I've talked about it. The educational system played a huge role, the civil servants played a huge role, and those legacies are still there. But you also want to trace any acts of agency on the part of the native populations. How did they respond to it? Right, going back to your religious identities is one form of it. Developing Marxist politics, let's say in Indian South, is another form of it. Developing communal politics is another form of it. So you want to look at post-colonial identities in a dynamic way in which the natives from the former colonies do have some agency, do have some way of defining themselves, right? And then also to see what role does the nation state play in it? What kind of narratives were mobilized when these people were fighting against the colonizers? What kind of a nation had they imagined, right? Because that's what then they try to construct, right? If Algeria had fought on the banner of Islam, which it didn't, then chances are that's what they will try to live up to, right? Just like in Pakistan, the general belief is that it was supposed to be a safe homeland for the Muslims of India. So those who want a purely confessional nation state, a religious nation state, point to that. It's like we were supposed to be a Muslim nation state. Why aren't we making it so, right? So most of the times also these nation states, post-colonial nation states, and their national identity gets caught in the narratives that they had mobilized to fight for their freedom. And that brings me to the most important question of identity, and that is national identity. So every post-colonial state creates or tries to create a national identity by developing a national language, national literatures, a federal government system, a system of law that is uniform, a constitution. So in one way or the other, there can be ethnic identities, regional identities, there can be religious identities, class identities, caste identities, and then education, law, the constitution, the politics is developed to create some form of allegiance to a national identity. To lose national identity or very highly articulated national identity. So at any given time, in any post-colonial nation states, there are identities that draw from the previous experience of colonizers, the elite, and the contemporary elite can then be very highly upward mobile, rich people who model their lives on contemporary powers, on America, on Europe, and are completely detached from everyday life of their own people. Those are class-based identities. And then there is, by and large, always a national mythology, a national identity which the nation state perpetuates. And sometimes there can be a national identity without a nation state. For example, the Palestinians, right? Or the people from Kashmir. So these are some of my thoughts about post-colonial identities, right? I'm pretty sure I didn't deal with it exhaustively. So if you have any questions, any suggestions, please feel free to share them. And the purpose here was to offer to you what I had already done in Urdu, so I hope this is useful to you. If you are looking for any good books on it, I would say Nation and Its Fragments by Partha Chatterjee is a really good book. Of course, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, and then the edited volume by Homi Bhabha, right? Nation and Narration. These are some of the 3 books that I would highly recommend. And of course, Chinwe Zhu I already mentioned, right? Decolonizing the African Mind. When I have time, I'll post the links to these books in the description, but do check these books out and they might be really useful to you. That's all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a part of my life. I will now see you next time. I hope you're taking care of each other. Please continue to do so. Continue making this world a better place. Okay, thank you, and as always, peace and love.